The Black Phone was a pretty big horror phenomenon back in 2021. It introduced us to the grabber, and its concept took the horror world by storm. Personally, I think it's one of the most unique original horror movies of the decade. But The Black Phone 2 is another sequel to an original horror film that just felt like a cash grab, that didn't know what direction they'd go in, especially after such a definitive ending. The Black Phone 2 is bigger, it's more ambitious, and it's more thematically interesting than every aspect of the first film, but I don't even know if that's a good thing. What made the first film work so well was its containment of story, and that, along with Blumhouse's recent record, a sequel felt like too much dip on their chip, but it's still here. And I think the strongest aspect is what's brought directly from the first film, which is the performances, as to me, they do end up evolving in a way that just is essential to the story and at least gives us some needed and apparent storyline and through line from the first and second film. Because really, this movie doesn't feel like a sequel to the first one, as it follows the sister in the Black Phone 1, not necessarily Mason Thames's Finney. I think that's a good and bad thing. I think the sister character allows for a different aspect to explore of the story, but I think they really only did that because the writer's room was basically like, let's find every little detail of the first film that we can and stretch it out as thin as possible so we can warrant making a second film. I'm going to be a little more critical about this just because I do enjoy Mason Thames's work a lot. The Black Phone 1 was the first thing I saw him in, and I've enjoyed a lot of his other stuff, and I kind of wanted to see him as a character evolve more. And though he does have a really interesting arc in this film, he's not nearly at the forefront that he was in the first movie. That's not to say this story was bad. It really is trying to explore a different level of just like lore and what's going on, the presentation of the world. I don't want to spoil anything, so I can't talk too much about what the film ends up exploring with the relationship between this sister character and the grabber himself. But it was just unexpected, and I didn't watch any trailers going in, and I did kind of feel underwhelmed leaving the film, as again, I went in knowing this was a sequel to The Black Phone, not thinking that we were going to follow a pretty much completely different character. Though we are following a different character, I do think Madeline McGraw, who plays Gwen, is actually really, really great. There are moments that I think Mason Thames and Madeline McGraw aren't really amazing, but the emotions still come across. You believe they're brother and sister, you believe all of the dynamics, so it does enough. I think the familial aspect of this movie is the part that works the best, and it makes sense because it's really the only aspect of the film that's brought a through line from the first to second film. Sadly, the worst part of this movie, though, does align with the direct through line between movies 1 and 2, and that is obviously spoilers for the end of the first film, but the grabber dies at the end of the first movie. I'm not going to explain how he comes back or what the method of communication is or anything lore-wise. Just watch the movie for yourself and find that out. But a serial child killer is so chilling, and that idea is virtually gone in this film. The grabber is such a minimal threat to every single person in this film except for the sister, and even then, the sister is virtually a completely different character than the first movie because she just has such little characterization. And so there is no through line on the villainous aspect of this movie, other than the fact that the grabber is the same guy that died in the first one. And on top of that, there's so little of the grabber. The best parts and sequences of this film are when the grabber actually has something to do, but really that's only like 2 or 3 major sequences. I wanted so much more Ethan Hawke. Like, he probably has 10 lines in this movie. I love Ethan Hawke's performance in the first film. I talked a lot more about that in my best horror movies of the 2020s so far ranked video. And then we have The Black Phone. I think The Black Phone has one of the most underrated Ethan Hawke performances. This film really decides to dive in on the past, and it's set at this getaway Christian camp that the children's mom went to, and I think for the most part the religious commentary of this film is also fairly lazy. A lot of it relies on the communication between the sister and the grabber, which again, I didn't really care for that either. Though I do think in the final act the religious commentary ends up working out because of the great action spectacle, but they never dive into it enough, and it's kind of just like this weird middle ground of the idea is there, but they don't want to fully commit to it. One of the most interesting swings the film takes, though, is because it dives into the past, and that is visually. They decide to do this really cool, like Super 8 film look. I think some of it was emulation, but some of it did look like it was actually filmed that way for flashbacks or other non-realm things. I'm going to stop there for spoilers' sake, but it's really interesting. It's really, really unique, and the way that they fade between digital and film, it's super, super cool. It felt like there was real horror craft, and they used that visual language in a really great way. It felt very purposeful, and that's what I mean by this film still takes swings, even though it feels like it wasn't necessarily a story that needed to be told. Like I said at the top of this video, this just felt like the writer's room wasn't prepared to make a second movie when coming up with the lore for the first, and I never expected that. They took every detail of the first film, stretched it as far as possible, and even then probably couldn't get enough out of Mason Thames' Finney character, so they decided to move on to his sister, who we barely explored in the first film. It's weird though, because story-wise, this film feels interesting enough for the majority of it, but it feels like it's for external factors, not necessarily like it's a Black Phone 2 and you're so interested in continuing Finney's story. The beginning is interesting because inherently you want to see where the franchise goes. You want to see how after the Grabber's death, do they continue these movies? The second act is where the faults start to come in. It is a little bit boring and it gets a little bit repetitive, but then the final act is really, really cool again. But I think as a cohesive piece is where this film really falls apart, because there's not as much details in the nuances of the film. The Grabber is actually like a slasher in the final act, and that's why it's so cool. Like there feels like there's like a threat to everyone, but for the majority of the film before that, it feels like he's only a threat to the sister, who again at this point I don't really care about. At the end of the day, the Black Phone 2 does feel unnecessary, but I think it is at least being as ambitious as possible for a sequel to a film that had a pretty definitive ending. Overall, I'm going to give the Black Phone 2 a 3 out of 5. If you still want to check out this movie, let me know what you thought of it in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.